There's a great deal of reincarnation research done by Ian Stevenson and now by Jim Tucker, for instance, that shows that what comes across between lives is information. That is, people come across with memories, or they come across scar tissue or birthmark where something happened to them. Give you an example of a case I personally studied. This was in India. So I had this little boy, and he said that he, in a previous life, had been a moneylender and that he had had an affair with a woman whose husband was a woodcutter, and that he had been killed by the woodcutter. We took him to the village that he said he had this previous life in, that nobody from his village even knew existed. We took him to the village, and when he got to the outskirts of the village, he walked immediately into the village as if he knew what he was doing, and he walked up to a particular house, and he knocked on the door. Older woman answered the door, and he called her by a pet name, a lover's name, and if she was startled, no one has called me that in years, that was my lover's name, and she told the story, and she said, I had an affair with a moneylender who had loaned us some money, and my husband was a woodcutter, and he came back one day and he caught us, and as my lover was trying to crawl out the window, my husband took his axe and killed him by striking him on the back. Now, the really weird part of this deal is this little boy had like a scar on exactly the place where the woodcutter had hit him in the previous life, had hit him with an axe.
Life is but a dream. Life is but a dream. Life is but a dream. Yeah.
Welcome to the Praise the Sun Podcast, where I'm honored to have on my guest, Stephan Schwartz. I'm really excited about doing this interview, and it's been a while since I've done an interview. We haven't had one since around November of last year, but this one is one that I've been really excited about, and I'm really honored to have this guest on the show. So if you all could definitely drop some likes and comments, because this is a great privilege and honor for me. So thank you so much. All right, let's bring on Stephan. All right. How you doing, Mr. Schwartz?
Doing very well, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. My first question is, how did you become interested in the topic of remote viewing? How did that come into your life?
Well, I created it. I got interested in it because I read all of the Edgar Cayce readings. Edgar Cayce was a man, he's been gone a long time now, but he was in many ways the best recorded, or the most detailed recorded remote viewer in history. A woman named Gladys Davis took down every word he said when he did these remote viewings, and kept track of everything related to it, and put together an archive that's really quite extraordinary. And there were about 15,000 of these things. But the first time I ever heard of it was when I was at university and I read Herodotus's Histories of the World. Herodotus is the father of history, and he was writing about a period about the 5th century BCE, so several thousand years ago, and he describes what today would be a perfect outbound remote viewing. Croesus, king of the Lydians, and when we say as rich as Croesus, the reason we say that is that he was the first person to coin money. But in any case, he thought he was going to be invaded by the Persians. So he sent 7 teams out, 7 embassies. In those days, the Greeks cultivated people who could remote view. They didn't call it remote viewing, but they had the 7 oracles of the ancient world, and people would go to the oracles and get what today we would call a remote viewing session. and they would ask them to give them precognitive information about the future or whatever. So anyway, he sent out 7 teams, and he thought about it. It was a very good, actually, a very well designed experiment. And he said to them, "You have to go to the 7 oracles, which were spread out over the Greek world. So you had to go by sea." And he said, "On the 100th day, from the day you leave, I want you to go into the oracle and ask, what is Croesus, son of Alyattes, king of the Lydians, doing today?" Lydia is now a part of Turkey. Anyway, so off they went. And the only one we know the answer to is the oracle at Delphi, because that was the accurate one, most accurate one, and the one that Herodotus wrote down. So in any case, they got there, and on the 100th day, they went in. And before they could say anything, the Pythonists, these were young girls who probably about 14 years old, who had been trained in meditation and who had a high capability of doing remote viewing. So before they even said anything, she said, "I can count the sands of time, the 100 days, and I see the great ocean, the trip that they had to take. And I see Croesus, and there's a great bronze urn and a great bronze lid, and he's putting a tortoise and a hare into this boiling water." And it didn't make any sense to them at all. But that's what she said. So they went back to Croesus, and when all the 7 teams got back from the 7 oracles, when the Oracle of Delphi team said what had happened to them, Croesus bowed down and gave obeisance, because he had thought to himself, what is this one thing that as a king, nobody would ever expect me to do? Exactly what you would do today. So he had a great bronze urn brought into the courtyard of his palace and hung from a tripod and heated up, filled with water. And he took a tortoise and a hare and cut them up and threw them in this boiling water, because he thought, well, if they said he's sitting on his throne issuing orders, well, I mean, he's a king. That's what kings do. So he wanted to do something that nobody could guess. And since it took him 100 days to get to the oracle, there was a long time, and they couldn't have any idea what he was doing. So in any case, he took the oracle at Croesus, oracle at Delphi, very seriously, and he sent another team back, and because he was convinced that Darius, the king of the Persians, much bigger empire, was going to attack him. And he was told that a great power would lose, and he thought it was the Persians, but it turned out to be himself. Anyway, I had read that at university as part of a study of how history began, and nobody called it remote viewing. It was in this book. I read it, and I couldn't make any sense of it. I didn't know what it meant. And then I got introduced to the Casey readings, and I had a deeper insight into what it was about. And then about 1968, this is a long time ago, I built a grid in my back garden in the house where I was living in Virginia Beach. And I would bury 35 millimeter film canisters. That's back when cameras had film, or little mason jars. And I'd put things in them and bury them in one of the grids. I started out with 12 grids and ended up making 144. And they were outlined with yellow rope, so that each a foot square. I would bury these things, and then I would make a drawing, a grid, which I would mimeograph of the grid and send it out and ask people, in one of these squares, I have buried something. Can you pick which square I've buried it in? And can you tell me what you see? I mean, that's how I created remote viewing. That's 1968. So I discovered that people could do it. In fact, they could frequently do it. And that's changed the whole thread of my life, because I began exploring what I call non-local consciousness. That is an aspect of consciousness that is outside of space-time. That is, people can describe things which have been buried and unknown for thousands of years, and they can describe things in great details. And I got interested in archaeology. I come out of an anthropology background. And I got interested in doing this in archaeology because at the time that I began, this is in the late 60s, one of the big questions in archaeology was where to look, because most archaeological sites, or many archaeological sites, were found serendipitously. That is, a farmer would be plowing a field and he'd discover a tomb, or some road crew would be building a highway and they'd discover a temple. And then the archaeologists would come in. So it provided, from my point of view, perfect triple blind conditions. That is, there was no possible way that it could be faked. Nobody knew the answer. Nobody had known the answer for hundreds or thousands of years. And I would ask people to locate archaeological sites, Cleopatra's Palace, Mark Antony's Palace, buried sunken ships on the seafloor. And the question also was, what is this phenomena? Is it electromagnetic? Is it somebody sending signals? Is there a sender, a receiver, a signal? And there was a Russian researcher, Leonid Vasilev, who asked the same question at the same time. This is again in the 60s. And he put people down into caves and down into mine shafts. He put them into things called Faraday cages, which shield electromagnetic radiation. And little by little, in a very careful way, he did research, and he eliminated everything in the electromagnetic spectrum except ELF, 3 to 300 hertz. Now, this was all done in the old Soviet Union, and I had a friend who was the head of the CIA. I was at that time. Now we're talking in the early 70s. I was the special assistant to the chief of naval operations, and I had this friend who was head of the CIA, Admiral Stansfield Turner, and he began to give me translations, I don't know how he got them, of these Vasilev experiments to answer this question, which I had and which Vasilev was trying to answer as well. And he said it had to be ELF. And a researcher in Canada named Michael Persinger also was doing experiments to see whether it was electromagnetic in nature. And he thought it had to be ELF. Now, as it happened, the Navy got interested in how would it be able to communicate with the ballistic missile submarines that stayed down, and they didn't want them to come close to the surface, because then the Soviet satellites would be able to pick them up where they were located. So the Navy spent $125 million trying to figure out how can we communicate with these things without having them come to the surface. And they tried all kinds of things in using radio communications, and they got it down to ELF too. They said, well, the only way that we could do it was to communicate with ELF because it would penetrate deepest into seawater. The problem was it could only communicate just a very little bit of information. If you saw a movie called The Search for Red October, there's a scene in where they get a message and they open up a book which they have on board the submarine, and it's like the message is like 1, 2, 3, 4, because that's all you could communicate. And in the book, 1, 2, 3, 4 meant something, and they could do it. So I came up with this idea, and I went to Hyman Rickover, who was the father of the American Nuclear Navy, and I asked him if I could put a couple of sailors in one of the submarines when they were doing their sea trials and do this experiment. Because if they would go down to depth and they could do what I called distant viewing in those days, if they could do a remote viewing, it would show that it wasn't electromagnetic because of the depth of the seawater, and 2, the amount of information they could get was greater than you could get with ELF. And he thought about it for a little while and called me the following week and said, no, I'm not going to do this because it'll get out and the media will get hold of it and they'll start talking about these missile submarines, and we just would prefer people didn't talk about them. Most Americans don't even know they exist. So I wasn't able to do it. And then in 1970, end of 76, I had left government and I wrote a book called The Secret Vaults of Time about all the remote viewing that had been done in the past before I got involved. And I stayed with a friend who'd been the deputy director of Navy Labs. And he said, you know that crazy submarine experiment you wanted to do? And I said, yeah, but where are you going to get a submarine? And he said, well, as it happens, we have a research submarine that's coming down to our facility. He had retired from the Navy, and he and another friend of mine, and they had taken over the Institute of Marine and Coastal Studies at the University of Southern California, and they had a facility out on Catalina Island, which is off the coast of LA. And he said, we've got this submarine that's coming down, and we're willing to pay for 3 days to let you do this experiment, which was just an astonishing gift. So I had people, I got sea charts, and I asked remote viewers who were scattered all over the place in several countries to locate a previously unknown wreck on the seafloor and describe for me in detail what I would find when I went there. And I went to the Bureau of Land Management Marine Sites Board and interviewed the guy who was the head of it. And I showed him the place that the remote viewers had picked. They had all picked this one place. And he said, nope, we don't know anything. There's nothing there. So the submarine, the Taurus, came down from Canada to be tested, do its sea trials. And we went out and I had him drop a pinger, a radio homing device, from the surface ship exactly where the remote viewers had picked. So we could only go to that one place. And we went and we found the ship and we found everything exactly as they described it. And you can watch a movie of this. I made a movie as it happened. You can go to my personal website, stephanschwartz.com, and I got Leonard Nimoy, Dr. Spock, to do the narration. And you can watch the movie and you can see it happen, that they locate this sunken ship on the bottom of the ocean between Catalina Island and Los Angeles. And everything that they described to be there was there, and how the ship sank, they described, turned out to be correct, and what we would find was correct, and the date at which it sank was correct. So that really was, first of all, it established that remote viewing could do things like this. And second of all, that it was not electromagnetic in nature.
Thank you for that wonderful answer. So when you initially began, did you have any form of training or anything? Like, how'd you learn how to do this? I know you read about it from Edgar Casey, but how'd you learn how to remote view?
I made it up.
So,
I thought I want to do triple blind experiments. A triple blind a triple blind experiment is that literally no living human knows the answer. So there was no possibility of cheating, because people were criticizing consciousness research at that time, saying, "Oh well, it's the expression on your face that's giving away the answer, or you're in league with the person who's doing it." Or, one case they said somebody's drilled a hole in the ceiling and they're looking down, and this is about guessing what card it was, and they can see the card, and they have a radio, they're telling the person what card it is. All kinds of nonsense. So I didn't want to deal with any of that. I wanted it all eliminated. So I wanted to do triple blind experiments. And in order to do a triple blind experiment like that, you had to be able to go to a part of consciousness to obtain information which no living human knew at the time you were providing it. And so I just created the protocol. And I decided that I would use multiple viewers because not everybody gets everything correct. That it would be the same as if you were trying to get a radio signal, you have multiple receivers, and because you're not getting a very good signal, but if you average across them, then you can get, what you're getting is correct. And so I had multiple viewers. I had independent scientists witness it. I got a woman named Ann Cale who was at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory to be my official witness. I notarized all of the prediction information before we did the field work, so there could be no question about the sequence of chronology. That is, no one could say, "Oh, well, you just made it all up at the end after you actually found it." So all of those kinds of criticisms, I didn't want to be bothered with any of that. So I created a protocol which came to be known as the Mobius Consensus Protocol. I created a protocol that used multiple viewers and that required that in order to get the answer to the questions I was asking, you had to open to an aspect of your consciousness that was outside of space and time. And I got that idea because in 1931, Max Planck, the father of quantum mechanics, was asked by a reporter at the Observer newspaper. He didn't give a lot of interviews. And the reporter said to him, you and Einstein are the two most famous scientists in the world. What have you learned? And I think they thought he was going to talk about molecules and atoms. But what he said was, what I've learned is that consciousness is causal and fundamental. You cannot get behind consciousness. Space-time arises from consciousness, not consciousness from space-time. And the materialist view was that consciousness, it was and is that consciousness is a result of brain activity and it's entirely within space-time. So what he was saying was, no, none of that is correct. Materialism isn't correct, that there is an aspect of consciousness that is outside of space-time and it is causal, and that in fact space-time was created by consciousness. And so I'd studied that at university, and I remembered that along with stuff about Croesus. And then after reading the Edgar Cayce readings, I just thought, well, if I'm going to do this, I want to do it in an impeccable way that can't be criticized. And so I will create this protocol, and I created the protocol, and I've been doing it that way ever since.
Thank you for that. So, if space time and please correct me if I'm misspeaking. If space time is a result of consciousness, am I correct in not saying that?
Yes,
So, does that mean reality itself is consciousness?
is created by consciousness. Yes. And
So,
it's created of information. Now, the two great mystery questions, and I don't have an answer for either one, I'm sorry, but nor does anybody else, is what is consciousness and what is information? I mean, when someone goes back and describes an archaeological site that has been unknown for 2,000 years, how do they access that information? Now, most people describe it as where do they go, but you see, that's a spatial term. That's you hear ideas about there are dimensions, the multi dimensions in consciousness and all that. But that can't possibly be right because those are all spatial terms. Dimension is a spatial term. So, what the research is suggesting, and I say suggesting, is that consciousness, I don't know what it is, but it is a unity. All consciousness is interconnected and interdependent, and that it creates things by manipulating information. And the information then can be used to create physical things, for instance, space time. Now, as I said, I don't know what information is and I don't know what consciousness is. What I do know is certain things about how you can manipulate consciousness to get information.
okay. So, um, so we cannot exactly define what consciousness is, but each individual, we all have consciousness, and is it a theory to say that since reality itself is consciousness, then we're a part of a higher level super conscious being, perhaps that's
Not high, not higher level. Again, level is a space term.
okay.
Are we part of a unity? Yes, I think so. Now that's I cannot prove that, but the research that is going on and has been going on shows that, for instance, it is possible for an individual to hold healing intention about another organism, another life form, anything from bacteria to humans, and have an effect on the well being of that organism, for good or bad, by the way. It's possible for an individual to obtain information about the past that no one could possibly know. And I'm doing this experiment right now. It's possible for a person to go into the future and get information. Now, the question that I have that I'm working on at the moment is when a person describes the future, are they describe remote views of the future? Are they describing a fixed future, or are they describing the highest probability of the future at the moment that I'm asking the question? And I don't know the answer to that yet. Although I think, based on the evidence I've got so far, it depends on how many people are holding that consciousness. So then you realize culture is the result of collective individual consciousness. That's why Italians cook eggplants in a different way than the Japanese or the Chinese. That's why certain sports are watched in one country but not particularly in another country. It's because these are cultural choices that are made because of collective individual intention. And so then you get to, well, how can individuals who don't have any money, don't have any power, don't command any armies, how can they cause changes in the culture? For instance, how was Gandhi able to get independence for India without a war? I mean, we couldn't do it in America. We had to have a war with the British in order to get our independence. But Gandhi was able to get independence from Britain when India was their most precious colonial possession, and he did it without a war. Now, how did he do it? And the answer is because he got the Indian people individually to hold a consciousness about independence. And that was sufficiently powerful to cause the British to choose to give India independence. And so, for instance, in the present state of the United States, where we're in such difficult situation, just being torn apart, the question I suggest to everybody is every day you make lots of tiny little decisions. If in the process of doing those tiny little decisions, of the options that are available to you, you only pick choices that foster well being. And enough people do this, that is how we will preserve our democracy and our culture. Because there are other people who are trying to create a different kind of culture and a different kind of government. And so, how do you do that? Well, as I say, once you understand that all consciousness is interconnected and interdependent, you realize, as Gandhi realized, that where you have high collective awareness and intention, you prevail. That's how Martin Luther King got the civil rights movement to work. He simply got enough people who said treating Black people equally is a good thing consistent with American values. That's what we want. And that's how Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act in the 60s. It was because enough people came to believe that that was the right thing to do. So that's what we need to do now.
Thank you. So, so for the average viewer who's watching this and they're really interested in learning this process, how can the average person learn how to remote view? What are the steps and protocols that the average person
Sure.
can?
Well, as it happens, I wrote a book about that. You want to go to Amazon or Ingram's and you get Opening to the Infinite, and it tells you everything we know in science about how to do remote viewing. It's a function of being able to attain and sustain intentioned, focused awareness. That's why meditators traditionally and regularly do better at remote viewing than non meditators. That's why religions of all kinds, I mean, they clothe it in their own special way, but that's why all religions teach some form of meditation because they have learned over the thousands of years that attaining and sustaining intentioned, focused awareness gives you access to this part of yourself, this the eternal self, what religion calls the soul. It gives you access to this part of yourself. So, if you want to learn how to do remote viewing, develop the daily practice of meditation. Uh, If you like, go to my personal website, stephanschwartz.com, download a copy of Meditation for Modern Minds. It'll walk you through it. You can use it every day to develop the discipline, or you can read about it. You can go to, as I said, you get my book, get the book, 8 Laws of Change, which also will tell you how to do it. So you develop the practice of meditation, and then you follow the directions that I give you, and it will tell you exactly how to do remote viewing. It's not complicated.
Awesome. Thank you. That I'm really optimistic about anyone who's listening to this and they're wanting to embark on that journey. I believe you can do it. Um,
You
so
can.
when yes, so have your group of remote viewers ever I know they viewed the future, but have they ever collectively viewed the past?
Sure.
Have they ever focused on the pyramids to see how those were created and built?
No, I didn't focus on the pyramids. That's the Pharaonic period. I focused on the Ptolemaic period because there was too much known about the Pharaonic period that I thought people will criticize. Oh, you read that in a book. You heard that at some lecture. Whereas the Ptolemaic period, which is Alexander the Great on, so 323 on, that not very much was known about that. And there were big questions. Where is Alexander's tomb? Where is Cleopatra's palace? Where is Mark Antony's palace? Where's the lighthouse of Pharos, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world? And we found all those things. So I focused on the Ptolemaic period because focusing on the Pharaonic period, there was just too much available that people could read, or that I'd be subject to criticism.
Understandable. I understand that. Um, are you familiar with the book called The Law of One?
No.
Okay. Um, it was a book by uh, John McCarthy, I think, and Don something and Carla Record, and they essentially they put Carla in a hypnotic kind of state of trance, and she was apparently interacting with this being who called himself Ra, who I guess was a called
Oh,
himself
yeah.
who called himself a collective consciousness, and
Yeah.
he they had like numerous books of just Raw talking about life on this planet and the different just the different paths and stuff. I asked that question to say, are there any parallels between a channeled state for someone who's like getting like a hypnotist putting someone in trance state and remote viewing? Are those two kind of similar states of consciousness of wavelength?
Excellent question. Yes. Well, in both cases, what you're doing is you are opening to the non local aspect of your consciousness. Now, mediumship, which is what you're talking about, or Casey, who went into a trance when he spoke and he talked about his higher self, all of it is about opening to the non local aspect of consciousness. Now, the oracles in Greece, for instance, or the talking idol of Ixchel, the Mayan idol, or the talking idol of Siwa, the Egyptian idol, all of those kind of things, they disassociate. That is, it's not me speaking, it's the God speaking, or the personality that I've contacted. It's a way of disassociating. And it may be that, in fact, because consciousness is eternal, and that there is continuity of consciousness. That is, there is an eternal aspect of you that is outside of space-time. And episodically, it chooses to incarnate a personality. And you choose your parents, you choose your race, you choose your economic background, you choose the geographic location where you're going to be born. And you come in, this is the realm of the will. And you make choices and set in motion patterns. We have an eternal self. That is what religion calls the soul. And episodically, for reasons that we don't fully understand, it will manifest and incarnate a personality. And you choose your parents, you choose your economic background, you choose your race, you choose your geographical location, all because it involves patterns, recurring patterns that you're working with. And there's a great deal of reincarnation research done by Stevenson and now by Jim Tucker, for instance, that shows that what comes across between lives is information. That is, people come across with memories, or they come across with scar tissue or birthmarks where something happened to them. To give you an example of a case I personally studied, this was in India, where because the culture accepts the idea of reincarnation, people talk about it more, although it happens in the United States just as frequently. They just don't talk about it. But in any case, so I had this little boy, and he said that he, in a previous life, had been a moneylender and that he had had an affair with a woman whose husband was a woodcutter, and that he had been killed by the woodcutter when he caught him with his wife. That's a weird story. So he said this happened in a village that his village in India, they'd never heard of it. So he took this little boy, he's about 7, not quite 8 years old. We took him to the village that he said that had this previous life in, that nobody from his village even knew existed. We took him to the village, and when he got to the outskirts of the village, he walked immediately into the village as if he knew what he was doing, and he walked up to a particular house. And he knocked on the door, and an older woman answered the door, and he called her by a pet name, a little lover's name. And if she was startled, that we took this little boy to this house that he just walked up to, sort of at random, and he knocked on the door, and this older woman answered the door, and he called her by a lover's name, a pet name. And she was very startled and said, "No one has called me that in years. That was my lover's name." And she told the story. And she said, "I had an affair with a moneylender who had loaned us some money. And my husband was a woodcutter, and he came back one day and he caught us. And as my lover was trying to crawl out the window, my husband took his axe and killed him by striking him on the back." Now, the really weird part of this deal is this little boy had like a scar on exactly the place where the woodcutter had hit him in the previous life, had hit him with an axe. So what comes across is information. We bring it across from life to life, and we make choices. And that's why I say this is the realm of the will, because what this is about is making choices and choosing And you want to always choose the thing that fosters well-being. That's why the idea of karma, where it comes from, that you make choices that set in motion bad patterns or negative patterns or positive patterns. So the point is that when you incarnate into space-time, you always want to make the choice, whatever, from the cat food or dog food you buy to the jobs you take, the businesses you do, the people you hang out with, whatever. You always want to pick, of the options available to you, ones which foster well-being for everybody, not just you, everybody. And when you do that, and other people do that, then you create a culture which fosters well-being, and everybody does better. And if you look at history, present day history, you can see, for instance, if you look at, for instance, the Nordic countries, where fostering well-being is a social priority, you see that there's less violence, there's better health care, there's not as much racial prejudice, there's not as much gender prejudice. Uh, People feel safer. There's less violence. They're more literate. They're better able to do mathematics. I mean, pick anything you like. When individuals in a culture collectively hold the intention to foster well-being, everybody does better.
That was an absolutely fascinating story. Wow, I have so many questions about the boy. Um, so, so it seems like during the reincarnation process, we accumulate some type of information that we carry from lifetime to lifetime that is imprinted on our bodies as well. Like
Well,
he had this.
our bodies, it's not imprinted on our bodies. You come in with information that literally alters your DNA.
Oh
That's why
wow.
you get the birthmarks or the scar tissues. And there's hundreds of these cases uh, from kids all over the world, that what's coming across is information remembered from these earlier lives, and that this information shapes how we think and behave. And so this is, as I said, the realm of the will, because you want to make choices that foster well-being. Because when you foster well-being, everybody benefits. More than that, from a social point of view, it's cheaper, it's more effective, it's more efficient, it's more productive, it's much nicer to live under, and it's also much cheaper. In the United States, our principal problem is we make profit the only social priority that matters. We don't make well-being a first priority. And as a result of that, we spend trillions of dollars more than we should in all sorts of ways, because we don't treat people equally. We don't treat gender equally. We spend money and we construct schemes that 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 prejudice against one group or another, and it's more expensive, and it causes violence, and all sorts of negative things, all of which can be dealt with by simply fostering well-being, treating people equally, treating genders equally, helping people develop their potential to their fullest degree, not just making profit the only social priority. That is the central problem in the United States.
Thank you. Um, I definitely have questions about the United States and that direction as well. But I want to talk about uh, the veil of forgetting. Why is it that some people, like the boy, can just recall memories like that, and then for some of us, it's almost as if this is the only lifetime we've ever lived. We don't remember anything else. Why is the veil either thicker for some people or very thin, or how does that work?
Well, I mean, in an absolute sense, I don't know the answer, neither does anybody else. What is suggested by the research itself, again, and this is very important, I am a fact person. All I care about is objectively verifiable facts. I'm not a philosopher. I'm not a theoretician. I'm not presenting myself as some sort of shamanic guru. I am a fact guy. I'm a research scientist. I do research. What I care about is objectively verifiable facts. So, at one level, I can't answer your question. What seems to be going on, this is, I note, what seems to be happening is that you create patterns and you incarnate your next life. You bring the pattern of behavior across, and you have to make choices about whether you're going to continue with that or whether you're going to relearn how to make those kind of choices and foster well-being. Now, why some people do this, come back with these open memories, and other people come back like this is the only time they've ever been alive, I don't know. I suspect it has to do with how significant the pattern you're working with has to be.
That makes sense. Thank you so much for that. So, for the group of remote viewers that you had view the future, did they ever foresee of a version of Earth where we diverge from this profit-based mentality, where we kind of more see each other in a well-being, holistic type of view, and we kind of come to our senses and realize we're destroying ourselves and the planet? Is that has that been viewed?
Yeah, yes. In 1978, I got very concerned because I had been in government, as I said, uh, and I had held high clearances. Like most people who were in the geophysical world, geopolitical world, I was convinced we were going to have a nuclear war. This was the height of the Cold War, Soviet Union, United States. And in fact, what very few people know is that were it not for one Soviet Lieutenant Colonel, Stanislav Petrov, we would have had a Third World War because the, the Soviet uh, nuclear defense system malfunctioned, and it showed up that all these American satellites were headed toward the Soviet Union. And this lieutenant colonel, got orders to press the button to launch the Soviet missiles. But the more he thought about it, he thought, no, the Americans aren't, they wouldn't do that. So they sent out a team to arrest him. And by the time they got there, they realized that the problem was that the system, the radar system, wasn't functioning properly, and that in fact there were no missiles, and that he was correct in not pushing the button. But in any case, I was very concerned. I had a little girl, just been born, and I was very concerned. What was my daughter's life going to be like? So in 1978, I began interviewing people to look at the year 2050. Now, why 2050? because if you go too far into the future, you can't understand what they're saying. I mean, if this were the 18th century and I told you that there was something you could wear on your wrist or stick in your pocket that would let you talk to anybody on earth practically, I mean, what would you make of that? How would you even try to figure that out? So I didn't want to get too far in the future. So 2050, it started in 78. I figured I would still understand what they were saying. Anyway, so I began asking people about 2050 and how we got there. And looking back now, I've done the research analysis. They said to me, one of my first questions was, has there been a nuclear war? Because that's what I was afraid of. They said no. And I said, well, then what's going on with the Soviet Union? And they said, this is 78. It doesn't exist. I go, what? One of the two superpowers on Earth doesn't exist? What do you mean it doesn't exist? Well, it doesn't exist. And I went around to friends of mine who were in the geopolitical world that I had come out of and said, can you imagine why the Soviet Union wouldn't exist? They said, no, that's just nuts. And another one, I asked them, well, what about healthcare? And they started talking to me about what today we think of as genetic engineering. But it hadn't begun yet. So I didn't have any idea what they were talking about. And they said, oh, and there's going to be a series of pandemics. I thought, pandemics? I'm thinking Spanish flu, 1918. They said, no, the first one will be a blood disease that crosses over from primates in Africa to humans, and it's going to kill millions of people. And I went around to a friend who was the deputy director of National Institutes of Health, and I said to him, do you know anything about, this is 79, do you know anything about a blood disease that crosses over from primates to humans and is going to kill millions of people? And he said to me, whatever it is you're smoking, quit, because that's nonsense. In 1981, the first HIV/AIDS cases emerged. It turned out this was a blood disease that crossed over from primates to humans, and it killed 35 million people, exactly as they described. And they said, oh, but this is only going to be the first of a series of pandemics because the Earth's environment is going to change. So what? They said, yes, it's the environment, the whole environment of the Earth is going to change. So what in the world is that about? And I was, for instance, in one case, I was interviewing somebody in Santa Monica, California. And I said to him, well, go forward in time to 2050, the same date as today. And what do you see? And they said, well, part of Santa Monica is underwater. I said, what do you mean underwater? They said, well, Santa Monica, Manhattan Beach, Hermosa Beach, Newport Beach, they're all partly underwater. I thought, what in the world? So I went around to a friend who was one of the leading climatologists in the United States, and I said to him, do you know why parts of Santa Monica would be underwater by 2050? And Hermosa Beach and Manhattan Beach? And he said to me, no, that is nonsense. And of course, in 91, first papers began to come out about climate change. And now, New York City, Norfolk, Virginia, Philadelphia, they're all, and in California, they're all building seawalls because the sea is rising and we're in the middle of climate change. About the Soviet Union, I told you in 78, they told me it just didn't exist. I couldn't make any sense of it. And of course, in 91, Soviet Union ceased to exist. We now do CRISPR technology, and one of the things that I'm very concerned with is that we're going to create a new species of humans, Homo superior. It's probably going to happen in Asia because they don't have the moral limitations about it that we do. And so what do you do if you create a subspecies or another species of human, Homo superior, that's as smart as Einstein, as athletic as Michael Jordan, and as handsome as, I don't know, pick your favorite movie star, and you create several thousand of these people, and because it costs a lot of money, only the rich do it, and you create a rich class of superhumans. Then what's going to happen to society? So I'm very concerned about that, and I'm looking at that. What I can tell you about this, because I'm still in the analysis phase, is that between 2040 and 2045, we're going to have something happen that is going to radically change American society. Now, I'm not quite sure what it is. At first, I thought it was one thing. And then somebody said, oh, well, maybe it's aliens are going to come down from space. And no, I don't think that's what it is. I suspect, based on, as I continue to do the analysis, it's climate change. It's the end of the internal combustion engine, the end of the carbon power era. The fact that the United States remains a country, but its real power devolves to the states. Because as you can see right now going on, as we're talking, the country's being torn into two countries, the red, blue, the states that are controlled by the Republicans and the states that are controlled by the Democrats. And if you look at the outcome data, you see that the Republican states have much lower social well-being than the Democratic states, and that this is growing year by year. And everything from literacy to women's rights to control their body, to education, to racial parity, to gender parity. I mean, just pick anything you like. The blue states are doing better than the red states. And by 2040, 2050, I think this is going to get to a point where, although we remain one country, we functionally have split into two groups. In any case, there's some kind of major transition between 2040 and 2045. Now it's over by 2050, 2060, because when I asked the people to the 2050s, and then in 2018, I started doing 2060 to see what the difference was. And what they all tell me is they're on the other side of it. So whatever it is, it goes from 2040 to 2045. It's a huge change that by 2050, 2060, there are no internal combustion engines. People don't travel as much. Racial and gender equality is no longer an issue. That people live simpler lives. Oh, wait, we got this plane, helicopter. That people live simpler lives. The description of the houses is more like Nordic housing today, or Dutch housing. Simpler housing, simpler lives. People in big cities, the office buildings have been converted. And this is happening actually, have been converted either to residences or to vertical farming. That people don't really go to offices much anymore because they communicate and work at home. You can already see this happening. It just gets bigger and bigger, but you can already see these trends taking shape. We are healthier, different kinds of health care. Health care is not so much antibiotics, for instance. It's It's much more about um, uh, using the CRISPR technologies to do genetic engineering. It's a very different country, but it still exists. And it hasn't had a war. People seem to behave with more focus on well-being than profit. So I guess it's doing better. It's just very different.
Thank you. That was plenty of information to work with. I have a few questions. So, being that it seems that we move towards a more minimalist type of living, is this due to like the environment changing, that radical shift? Is it that I've been noticing that I live here in the Midwest in the Chicago area, and I've been noticing the winters have been getting increasingly short, and I wasn't sure is that an environmental thing as well? Is that something I might
Yeah,
is that like the planet heating up, or is that
yes, the
any,
planet is heating up. The lake that you're on is beginning to rise. We're going to see major changes in the weather patterns. You're already doing that. In Chicago, you're also already seeing office buildings being turned into either residential structures or even vertical farms. Um, so, Chicago, as an example, is going to become a quite different city. You're going to have very different weather patterns. You're going to see a reduction in violence. I think one of the things I'm looking at right now is, do we finally do something about guns? Because the United States has more guns than people, and there's no other country, no other developed country in the world that has the kind of gun violence that we have. But I don't see the remote viewers talking to me about gun violence. So I think something happens about controlling guns, and that the gun manufacturers who bribe the congressmen to not pass any laws, that's going to change. So Chicago is going to become a safer city, different weather, different relationship with the lake, no carbon energy, no trucks or cars with internal combustion, people working more from home, less extravagance, I guess maybe that's the way to put it, um, simpler. Education is going to improve. So, in some ways that I can see clearly, we're going to do better. In other ways, I'm not quite sure what's going to happen, but it is very clear that it's going to be very different. But it's not going to be, space people have come down and taken over and all that sort of thing. What I do think is going on with UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena, what I do think is going on is that all cultures on any planet that develop technology get to a place where the technology either destroys them or they wake up to realize that all life is interconnected and interdependent, and they start making policies and technological choices that foster well-being. And that we're at that place where our technology is either going to destroy us. Look at all the microplastics, for instance, in the water. Look at all the pollution, as an example. Look at the obscene wealth inequality in the United States. That's either going to destroy us, or we're going to wake up and make different choices. And I think that's true on any planet whatever species that develops technology, because technology keeps going, and unless you uh, take control of it in a way that fosters well-being, then it takes over. And of course, we're also at a place with artificial intelligence where are we going to be dominated by artificial intelligence, or are we going to maintain control of artificial intelligence? And it didn't clear yet. And so all of these reports of UAPs is they're watching us like cultural anthropologists study primitive tribes. They're watching to see which way we're going to go, and we're at the crossroads.
The crossroads. That makes sense. The a question about the subhuman species that grows. So as will there be some type of experimentation that creates bodies that have a longer lifespan than us, than the humans that we have now?
Well, the Homo superior, as I told you, the thing that worries me, because I think it's going to be done, it's going to be expensive, and so only rich people are going to be able to afford it, is the creation of a new Homo superior, a new hominid species. And how does that work? I mean, what would you do if you had 10,000? Because whatever it is, the change, it'll get passed on to the next generation. So what happens if you create, I don't know, 10,000 people who are billionaires, who are as smart as Einstein, and who are as athletic as Michael Jordan, as I said, and as handsome as your movie star, and who live longer because they don't get cancer, they don't get heart disease, they don't get any number of diseases, because they have been genetically engineered for that not to happen. So, what is the effect that group would have on the majority of Homo sapiens, the majority of Americans? That is very unclear to me. And I'm trying to do research on that right now, because that really concerns me, the Homo superior idea, because Homo superior linked with artificial intelligence, that is, these superhumans that control artificial intelligence, that could have a very bad outcome. I will say that the 2050s and the 2060s remote viewers are telling me that people are okay. So we must figure out some way to deal with this, but I don't quite know how it happens yet.
That's definitely has been my question. It's more so it's like the people who are wealthy and rich. How do we know, like right now they have that technology of kind of just taking their consciousness and putting it in a new body, even if it's not Homo superior, it could be just a clone body. How do we know that they don't already are experimenting with something like that?
Well, because we're not technologically advanced enough to do it yet.
Okay. Okay, makes
That,
sense.
I, they're not going to put them in a new body. What they're going to do is um, genetically engineer the uh, the children of these people, so that it's like artificial insemination. They're going to manipulate the egg and the sperm, and in such a way that these children are born with these particular abilities, or these particular protections against diseases. So what happens? And that part I'm not clear about. I don't know. I'm continuing to collect data, and I do an analysis. I've got 10,000 pages of data, so it's a lot of work.
And this data that's being accumulated, will it ever be public? Is it on your website? How can people who want to learn more, you know, read about this data?
I'm writing a book,
Okay.
so I'll get the book out. I'm, you know, it's just it's just a lot of work. But
Yes.
I'm writing a book on it that will be out. If you're interested, you can go to my personal website, stephanschwartz.com, and you can sign up to be on the list to get the announcement when I have the book ready. But that's I'm working on it.
Okay.
I've been doing it for 45 years.
And is there like a group of individuals like yourself who are like mission driven to like continue this and like pass this down to future generations to continue to see the no?
No, I don't know anybody else that's doing this.
Oh wow.
I know people who claim that they're doing it, and all kinds of things, but no, I don't know. I have about 6,000 remote viewers all over the world, men, women, all kinds of people. And I've collected the data, and I'm doing an analysis of it, and I'm just looking at it concept by concept, trying to figure out what it is they're trying to say. Not everybody gets everything right. What I look for is where there is consensus, where people over and over again say, an example, for instance, is uh, and now it seems obvious, but when I started in '78, it wasn't so obvious. It was the end of the internal combustion engine. In 1978, who thought that internal combustion engines were going to disappear? And yet now you see countries all over Europe and in some states in the United States have said 2040, we're going to get all the internal combustion off the road. So, an interesting thing is as we make this conversion to the electronic vehicles, at the moment, we're recreating what I call the gas station model. That is, you have charging stations where you go. But I don't think that's what's going to happen. And it's already beginning. What I'm describing is already beginning. What they're going to do is the roads are going to charge the vehicles as they drive over them. And this is already being developed. When they first began describing this, they said to me, I said, well, where do you go to get charged? And, well, you don't. You just drive on the road. So I don't think it's going to be every road, but it's going to be major roads are going to charge vehicles so that the whole business of running out of electricity, and having a charging station and the whole gas station approach, that's not what's going to happen. What's going to happen is that the roadways are going to charge the vehicles.
That makes sense. Okay. All right. These are my last few questions. This ones I really wanted to ask you ever since I found out about it in a video. So uh, recently I saw a video with physicist Dr. James Gates, and he was saying that he found a computer correcting code written into the fabric of space time. And that really interests me because I didn't really understand what that meant, but I wanted to know if that made any sense to you, how a physicist could find error correcting computer code written into the fabric of space time.
Well, I think what you're dealing with is that consciousness is causal. You, 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 it's a radical reassessment of what we think of as reality when you understand that consciousness is causal and fundamental, and that space time is a creation of intentioned consciousness. So, if that's true, then it's not surprising that there is error correction in the system. Because isn't that what you would do if you were creating a system? Wouldn't you create some kind of error correcting so
Yeah.
that as it went along, something could that was not working properly could be corrected? I mean, you got to start with this idea that consciousness is causal and fundamental, and that what we call reality, space time, is a manifestation of consciousness through the manipulation of information.
Thank you. Um, so, for the environmental changes, the people who might be worried that their state might be flooded or something like that, are there any states that people might want to migrate away from in the next 20 years? Um, okay, yeah.
Good question. Yes, there are going to be three major migrations in the United States: away from the coasts because of sea rise. You can already see it happening. Look at Florida, for instance. The I used to tell people when I would do these kind of interviews in the years ago, I would say, look at the insurance companies and what they do, because they're spending a lot of time and energy and money looking at the future because they're in the insurance business. And when they think that something bad is going to happen, you're not going to be able to get insurance. And look at what's happening in Florida. You can't get home insurance. Why? Because the insurance companies have looked at the sea rise and the failure of the DeSantis government to properly deal with the sea rise. I mean, it's a disastrous government, and you just can't get home insurance. So, away from the coasts, that's East Coast, West Coast, uh, river, a city like New Orleans, for instance, which also, if it were in a private country, it'd be a third world country. They're not doing anything near what they should be doing. Basically, red states are going to have a much harder time than blue states. But anyway, three migrations: away from the coast because of sea rise, out of the southwest because of increased temperature and lack of water. Look at what's happening with the Colorado River right now. For instance, 7 states depend on it for water. It's drying up. Look at the temperatures. They're talking about, for instance, Phoenix, they could have up to 100 days a year where the temperature above 114 or 114. I mean, just impossible temperatures. So out of the Southwest, out of the central states, because they have cataclysmic weather events like tornadoes. I mean, how many times do you rebuild a city that's destroyed by tornadoes? So we're going to have these three big migrations. People are going to move, I think, to the northwest, to the northeast, because it's going to get warmer there and probably wetter. I live in Washington State, and that's definitely what's happening. They're going to move away from coastal cities because they're not doing what they need to do to protect themselves. Now, New York, for instance, on the other hand, is building these sea walls. They're following what's called the Dutch model, because the Dutch in the Netherlands, most of the country's below sea level, and so they have built these big sea walls in order to protect themselves. And in New York, they're doing the same thing. They're building these 10-foot walls, and so that's a blue state, and they're taking it seriously. California is taking it seriously. Washington State taking it seriously, but a lot of the red states just don't even believe it's happening. There's still a large number of people in the United States don't think climate change is real. I mean, that's crazy, but they don't. So out of the coast, because of too much water, out of the southwest, not enough water, too high temperatures, out of some of the central states because of cataclysmic weather events. Now that's going to happen over the next 40 years, and you can already see it starting.
Wow, that I feel like that doesn't leave too many places to go. If you can't go around the coast, can't go southwest. In the central states, I'm assuming we'll probably have like tornadoes or something like that. Since that's usually since it's not along the
Yeah.
coast, that really is like either tornadoes or earthquakes or something.
So it's going to
Okay,
reorganize the population.
right.
And the other thing is, you know, when I was back in government back in the 70s, I was part of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology Secretary of Defense discussion group on innovation, technology, in the future. And there was another one organized at the Smithsonian Institution, and I was part of that too. And, everybody was worried about overpopulation and lack of resources. That was the big deal. We're going to get overpopulated, and we're not going to have enough raw materials to keep going. That's not true. Overpopulation, nobody in the remote viewing tells me that overpopulation is a big issue. And if you look at the country, for instance, or actually many developed countries, but let's do the United States, what you see is A, women are having children later in life, they're having fewer children. Men have decreasing fertility. That is, their sperm count, they're decreasingly fertile. So it's harder for them to impregnate their wife or a woman in order to have a child. So we're going to have fewer children. Overpopulation is not a big deal. Fewer people redistributed in states, particularly those states that are taking the trouble now to begin preparing for climate change, and those states which are not, largely red states, Florida, Louisiana, Mississippi, less population, people leaving. Now that's unusual because people have been immigrating, for instance, into Arizona because they like the weather. But when it gets to 114, they're not going to like it so much. People are leaving states. You look at a state like Idaho, because of the Dobbs decision, women can't get proper medical care. In the city of Sandy Point, for instance, they only have one hospital and it closed to obstetrical care. And therefore, all the OBGYNs left. So in these red states, it's going to be harder and harder for women to get proper medical care. They're going to leave. LGBTQ people are leaving red states because of prejudice. Uh, Black people are leaving some of these red states because of prejudice, racism, white supremacy. So, because of these cultural issues that are tearing the country apart, plus what's going on with climate change and everything else, we're going to see a population redistribution. And there's not going to be overpopulation. It's going to be a different kind of country, simpler. We are not going to be the great world power that we have been since World War II. I suspect in many ways China is going to become the leading economic power, but I'm not certain of that yet. But in any case, the United States is just going to be a very different country.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. So my last question is I'm a day trader, so I'm very much involved in the different financial markets and stuff like that. Um, is that gonna be around in 20, 40 years? Is there gonna be a stock market or even a real estate market? Is there If I recall correctly, I remember you
Well,
saying there's going to be like $1 trillion collapse or something like that in the real estate or something like that.
no, I mean, there's going to be real estate, people buying and selling, but the structures are going to change. Now, I haven't specifically asked if there's a stock market, so I don't know the answer to that, but I suspect it will continue, but it will change. First of all, the big change, which is really sort of a philosophical change, is that it's going to become clear that we have got to foster well being at every level, from the bacteria in the soil to the human beings to the birds in the sky and the fish in the sea. And we can already see this happening. Look at what is happening with chemical, single, monocrop, chemical industrial agriculture. It's not working. And so we are converting to a more holistic form of agriculture. Look at what's happening um, with uh, medicine. We are changing medicine. I don't mean just that in the red states that the suppression of women is causing a change, although that too, but also just the nature of how medicine is practiced is changing. We're moving more and more into the, the kind of CRISPR technologies and genetic engineering uh, than the traditional ways we've done it. The legal system's going to change. The good things, equality. When I talk to the remote viewers about gender equality and racial equality, they say, oh, that's just not an issue anymore, which I think is very good news. I was part of the civil rights movement in the 50s, and I went and heard Dr. King give the I Have a Dream speech in Washington. So I I see some good things, just different things. And the key to it is going to be for each individual, if you want to prepare for this, is you start making choices in which all of the choices you make of the options available to you are the best one that fosters well-being. Because when 10% of any population change in consciousness, then the entire culture changes. I'll give you two examples very quickly. When I went to hear Dr. King give the I Have a Dream speech, the word Negro was the general term that people used, including uh, Dr. King. You never hear that anymore. You never hear people talk about colored people, NAACP. You never hear that. Why? Nobody passed a law that said you can't do it. What happened was enough people in the culture said, that is not a polite way to do it. I'm not going to do that anymore. And it changed. Look at what happened. Gay became LGBTQ. Why? Nobody passed a law. The president didn't go on television and say, we're now going to say LGBTQ. What happened? And the answer is because enough people individually changed their position, made a decision. They weren't going to say that anymore. I'll give you a third one. When I was a boy, you went to somebody's house, there was an ashtray on the coffee table, and there was a pack of cigarettes and a cigarette lighter. You never see that anymore. Why? Did someone pass a law that said you can't smoke cigarettes? No. What happened was the doctors began to make the medical information clear, and people individually chose to quit. So the power of individual choice is what creates culture. and you, everybody that's listening to this show, if you will make your choices only choices which foster well being, you only buy from companies that foster well being, you only go to places, restaurants, sports events, whatever, that foster well being. You start doing that, the whole culture will change because, as I said, when 10% of any culture changes its consciousness, the whole culture has to accommodate.
Thank you so much for your time, Mr. Schwartz. That's an excellent way to end the show. I couldn't have said it better myself. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for your time. Where can people find out more and read your books? Where should they be directed to?
Well, you go to my personal website, www.stephanschwartz.com. I publish a daily web publication, www.schwartzreport.net. I do a podcast every week, Sports Report Podcast. Go to YouTube and find it. So you go to my podcast, you go to my daily web publication, schwartzreport.net. You go to my personal website, stephanschwartz.com. You go to Amazon. You search on my name. You'll find all my books. You go to academia.edu. You find all my scientific papers. I make everything available that I can, and I either no charge at all or the smallest charge I can put. So I make everything I do as available as I can.
I had no idea you had a weekly podcast. That's amazing. Is it so? Is it just on your website, or is it like on
Yes.
other platforms? Okay,
Go to schwartzreport.net. It's the news publication. I do it every day. I give it away. I don't charge, and I don't let them put advertising on it because I don't have time to check on whether the companies foster well-being. You go to my podcast. I do it every Friday. You go to YouTube, Schwartz Report, you find it. I put my papers, my scientific papers up on academia.edu so that you can get all of my science research. You can get all my books on my personal website, stephanschwartz.com. I try to foster well being in every way I can, and I try to make this stuff available um, either for free or at the lowest cost I can do.
perfect. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Okay, you take care.
You too. Thank you.